my plan tonight was I was going to read out, I wrote a very short introduction to John Lennon, and I was going to read a wee tiny bit of it, but you'll be absolutely delighted to know that I actually found, or forgotten, or written an article about it, so it's a wee bit longer. So I'm going to read you an article I wrote about John Lennon, and then two or three very, very short things later on, which are fiction. This is a wee thing on John Lennon, seen as a night of music right. Okay. John Winston Lennon. Yes, his name's Winston after Churchill, which in itself is extraordinary what I'm going to talk about. John was a smart one of the Fab Four, and he moved through three distinct periods in his lyric writing. All the boy meets girl la la songs of the early Beatles, but always distinguishable from McCartney's for their rather dour, bordering on misogynist, well not bordering, actually misogynist and homophobic and anti-Semitic notes. Then after that period came the nonsense, or the nonsense numbers, the druggy, through-the-looking-glass dream worlds, where the outwardly successful Lennon preferred to inhabit. And then lastly, apart from his final album, the protest songs, which is one I want to talk about. When we think of the protest song, we think of the 1950s, 1960s, from Woody Guthrie to Dylan, Pete Seeger, the Civil Rights Movement. It's the Weavers and Phil Oakes, it's Joanne Baez. This side of the Atlantic we had Ewan McCall. But in the popular imagination, it was the American boomer phenomenon. Young men and women who were in it for the greater good and not the money. And when Dylan started making money, he stopped writing protest songs. Actually, I think that's not true, but that's a discussion for another day. But it's a popular conception. When I first started buying records, I really believed in the transformative powers of pop music. The year of those first purchases is crucial. It was 1970. I remember my first 5 albums. I remember every album I bought, more or less the date I bought them. Well after, in pop years anyway, the Summer of Love, or Paris Spring, or Woodstock. For fans just a tad older, rock's music promise had already turned sour. It was no go the peace mix, no go all you need is love. All we wanted was a jab in the arm. What we got was My Lai revelations, the death of Hendrix, and the Manson family. But I still dreamt there was something radical in having sympathy with the establishment's devil. For the best part of my record buying life, I've watched old heroes turn into tax exiles, make racist statements, declare support for the Tories, become evangelist Christians and Muslims, spend more money on their mansions than Britain offered to the developing world. But I kept right on believing. And arguably the most direct and ferocious protest songs of all were being written not in the 1960s, but in the embittered 1970s by an unimaginably rich rock star. The Beatles, much as I danced to and sang along with them, weren't where you turn to for political insights or anger. But they invented, together with Dylan and Presley, modern pop and rock, and played, almost unwittingly for 3 of them at least, a vital role in that most pivotal of decades, the 1960s. From the dark satanic cavern, dressed in leather and Elvis quiffs, to the counterculture, the Isle of Wight and flower power, their revolution was almost purely musical. While guitarists at the time, generally speaking since, were happy with G, C and D 3-chord sequences, or E-based R&B riffs, a simple song like Ask Me Why, on the very first Beatles album, written by John and Paul when they were barely out of their teens, moves from F sharp major to G sharp major to C sharp major and P7. By the time they're writing Help, they're using mysterious clusters of chords that have foxed talented instrumentalists ever since. Michelle, a pleasant little love ditty, begins with an almost unwritable chord, which is somewhere around C7, add 9, add 11. And all performed casually, bobbing their mop tops in front of an audience more interested in screaming and fainting than in listening. By the end of their career, they're playing music so sophisticated and experimental that classical composers are taking a lead from pop rather than the other way around. Lennon had watched the rise of Bob Dylan with fascination and not a little jealousy. Dylan, he recognised, could create as much excitement with just an acoustic guitar and a harmonica as the Beatles and the Stones did with all their amps and drum kits. A genuine rebel, while the Beatles were still the darlings of the mums and the media. While Paul was being deeply influenced by the sonic complexity of bands like the Beach Boys, from Rubber Soul on, John was trying to find a way of expressing himself more honestly within the structure of rock and roll. It was a genuine driving need. Despite his newly found wealth, the adulation and respect he was being given, he felt like a loser. Beatle John had been manufactured by others. He grew to despise the screaming fans. He increasingly felt he was a vehicle for the men in suits used to relieve young people of their money. That famous statement. With the people in the cheaper seats, clap your hands, and the rest of you, rattle your jewellery. It's more than just a joke. In 1963, it's a sign of a political development that was to follow. He struggled within the Beatles to find that political voice. McCartney and Harrison made at least as good a fist of it. Get Back and Eleanor Rigby, for instance, tackled transgender, if in a northern blokey way, and alienation. Harrison's sitar songs looked to the east for answers to capitalism's shortcomings. Then again, he also wrote Taxman. Lennon did come up with Revolution, a lyric that introduces us early to his muddled political thinking. Ironically, it was McCartney, much more at ease with the modern art movements and feminism, who brought John along to see Yoko Ono's London exhibition, thereby replacing himself as Lennon's main songwriting collaborator. Only then did the Beatles record directly political songs. Give Peace a Chance, of course, is really the end of the Fab Four, and Lennon's start of a new radical journey with Ono. John and Yoko's honeymoon has become one of the most famous events of the 20th century. The couple booked a room at the Amsterdam Hilton and invited friends and the press to come along and visit. Against a background of anti-Vietnam demonstrations, they turned their marriage into a global protest of their own. The press turned up expecting the iconoclastic Lennons to be naked in their room or worse. Instead, they found the pair in bed, in pyjamas, under signs reading "Bed Peace" and "Hair Peace" and "I love Yoko, I love John." From Amsterdam, they planned to take their protest to the US, the country actually fighting in Vietnam. President Nixon's administration, facing a maelstrom of ferocious mass demonstrations, wasn't keen to have another rabble-rouser in their midst and refused them entry. So instead, John and Yoko go to Canada. They set up their second bed-in a hotel in Montreal. Again, the international media were invited, and again they were scathing. John couldn't understand how they didn't see the humour in it. He says, "It's part of our policy not to be taken seriously. Our opposition, whoever they may be in all manifest forms, don't know how to handle humour. And we are humorous." A phrase he kept using every time a reporter asked what they were doing was, "All we're saying is, give peace a chance." And he knew he had a song in his hands. He recorded it there and there in the hotel room, a dozen or more friends on hand, a hodgepodge, only some of whom were like-minded souls, included Allen Ginsberg, Timothy Leary, and bizarrely Petula Clark, chanted along with him and Yoko. John also claimed that Bob Dylan was there before them, sadly. As the Beatles hadn't officially yet split, the songs attributed to Lennon and McCartney, a ridiculous notion. McCartney would have nothing to do with that. For the next 5 years, John and Yoko throw themselves headlong into radical politics. John spoke out not only against the war in Vietnam, but against all the injustices he saw around him. He handed back his MBE in protest at Britain's part in the Nigerian Civil War, but also to show disapproval of the UK's tacit support of America in Vietnam. By the 1970s, the old love and freedom singers and bands had either given up or faded away. Joan Baez, Peter, Paul and Mary, or had moved on to darker, less overtly political lyrics. The Byrds, Simon Garfunkel, Dylan himself. Lennon stepped up and took their place. 10 years of writing either simple yeah, yeah, yeah lyrics or witty, deliberately obscure songs gave way to a directly ferocious political statement. Give Me Some Truth is truculent and scathing and names Richard Nixon personally. I Don't Want to Be a Soldier is a fierce anti-war song. Immediately after the Bogside Massacre in 1972, when 26 unarmed protesters were shot dead by the British Army, John responded with his mordant Sunday Bloody Sunday. He developed an extraordinary ability to write simple but effective protest songs, mixing the personal and the political in a way no one had done before, not even Dylan. Interviewed by radical thinkers Tariq Ali and Robin Blackburn for their Red Mole newspaper, he became aware of the phrase, "power to the people." He went home that night and wrote a song around it. phoning Ali the next day to sing it to him on the phone. Lennon says, "Oh, I just felt inspired by what they said, although a lot of it was gobbledygook. So I wrote Power to the People, the same way I wrote Give Peace a Chance, as something for the people to sing." Gobbledygook. Lennon's anger and his ability to write songs for the people to sing is not in question. His understanding of politics most certainly is. His two most famous songs infuriated as many people, even on the left, perhaps especially on the left, as they inspired others. To many, Lennon was indeed a hero, but working class hero was. By a stretch, the most bourgeois of the Beatles, growing up in the relative comfort of Aunt Mimi's big house on the hill, was it empty posturing to cite himself as some kind of working class hero and martyr for the proletariat? And how about imagining no possessions? Sitting at a quite grand piano, the one he actually wrote it on was sold for £2 million, in a mansion with acres of land in Ascot. But Lennon not only wrote political songs, he put his money where his mouth was. He became personally and financially involved in radical movements around the globe. He turned up at demos. His house was open to any kind of activist. He spoke in the mass media. He threw his weight and his checkbook behind Malcolm X and the Black Power movement. To qualify as a voice of the left, are you required to give up your home and your piano and the shirt on your back? Were that the case, we'd be robbed of many of our greatest minds and spirits. And isn't it legitimate to sing of the injustices to others, even if you yourself are living comfortably? Not being working class is the same argument the right uses against the anti-apartheid movement. If you're not black, you can't comment. Being rich isn't the central problem with Lennon's politics. By a scattergun approach, funding and supporting causes that have very little in common, we can only conclude that neither he nor Yoko were ones for deep political thinking. That what roused them both was an anti-establishment anger. Anything then that attacked established institutions was good enough for them, and to hell with contradictions. The world needed to change, and anything that looked as if it might help bring down the old order was fine by them. The key question, it seems to be now, after spending the best part of a year pondering the songs when I was writing the book, and reading anything and buying about them I could get my hands on, is how deep did even their hatred of the establishment really go? Was it all at heart deeply personal? The existing order displacing their own, and especially John's, inner turmoil. Years after Imagine's release, when challenged by a friend about wishing for no possessions, John curtly said, "It's only a bloody song." Had he lived longer, we may well have seen Lennon going all the way of all rock and roll flesh. His last album, Double Fantasy, is cosily warm, self-satisfied, ending with a track called Hard Times Are Over. Pizza and fairy tales, he once called McCartney's music. With his personal demons finally silenced, would Lennon have turned his back and protested forevermore? Were all those furious tirades nothing more than a poor little rich boy kicking against the world? Whatever unanswered questions, or for all the inconsistencies in Lennon's political thinking over the years of the Beatles, why not give him the benefit of the doubt? There can be no doubting his commitment from the late 60s to the mid-70s at least. He spoke out against Britain's behaviour in Northern Ireland. He helped the Upper Clyde shipbuilders in their legendary sit-in. Together with Dylan, Che Guevara and a handful of others, John Lennon was one of the people who expanded the horizons of millions over the previous 20 years. And his death could very well have come from his politicking. He made a number of very powerful enemies. And in a way there's a connection, a tragic, twisted connection with his idealism. But his murder also has a strange relationship with that other kind of song Lennon wrote so wonderfully. Those strange, light but dark lyrics he specialised in before he found his radical voice. Strawberry Fields, Lucy in the Sky, and his last great collaboration with McCartney, A Day in the Life, and of course, I Am the Walrus, where the singer-narrator seems to actually live in the bizarre world of that song. Until he found a way of venting his anger, John, the smart one, hid inside dreams and created fantasy worlds. Mark David Chapman, the man who killed him, was a huge fan of both John Lennon and J.D. Salinger's fictional hero, Catcher in the Rye, Holden Caulfield. Reading everything he could of John, Chapman was incensed by his old hero's newfound happiness and his rock star wealth,
Lennon, he felt, had betrayed all his own ideals. He became fixated by a bizarre idea. If he could rid the world of the evil of the new John Lennon, Chapman could live inside Salinger's fictional world and actually become Holden Caulfield. Back in the 60s, Lennon had made an off-the-cuff quip to an interviewer. I'll probably be popped off by a loony someday. In his one and only cinema role outside of the Beatles films, John played Musketeer Gripweed in the black comedy How I Won the War in 1967. At the end, Gripweed is shot in the stomach. Cynthia, John's then wife, watched in horror as Lennon acted slowly, sinking to the ground and dying. And she said at the time she was sure she was watching not a film, but a premonition. Chapman is still serving prison sentence for the murder of Lennon. In 1980, he was a 25-year-old security guard visiting New York from his home in Honolulu. I really didn't mean to hurt anyone, he said afterwards, weirdly evoking Lennon's song Jealous Guy. I really liked John Lennon. Lennon paid the ultimate price for his art. Chapman followed his lead in trying to interpret the madness of the world through creating inner landscapes and realities. But he was punishing his hero too for saying one thing and doing another. We shouldn't continue to punish Lennon for the same inconsistencies. He may have been incoherent in his politics. He may even at times have been disingenuous. But the raw honesty of his songs is undeniable. And he stood up and was counted when the rest of rock and roll was more interested in living it up and making money. Most importantly, John Lennon gave us the most powerful protest songs that will continue to outlive his 50s.